Okay, so far you should have built your jQuery. You should have built your jQuery UI into your first and second task. So your detail page and your list page. That's the first two tasks. So it's a question of working out which widgets to use and how you're going to use them and how you can use jQuery. And the more creative you are and the more exciting it is and the more useful it is, the higher grade you're going to get for this. Okay, that's the big thing about task 1 and task 2. Thank you. Do you want to drop one off on this side as you come down? A copy. Cheers. Thanks for that. I finally caught up with myself now. Thanks. Okay, so we are 2 tasks into a 4-task assignment. The final 2 tasks for this particular assignment is we're going to look at form validation today. Okay, we're going to look at how we use jQuery to validate forms. And next week's tasks is we're going to look at Ajax, how we can pull data into our web pages without having to reload the page. Okay, and that will complete our client-side scripting. Now next year, if you're doing 305, the language you're learning now, JavaScript, is going to be used for every single part of 305. It's the main language you need to learn. So start to get your head around JavaScript as we're doing this assignment. Okay, right? Yes? You good? You okay? Yeah. Is that screen okay, by the way, is it? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Still got to see it from where I'm standing. Okay, now, form validation. So let's see where we've got to so far. Okay, we have already spent a session on introducing JavaScript and client-side scripting. We've already done that, haven't we? That was the first session. And we looked at the DOM. Remember the document object model, how you can select different elements out of your page? It's an API which allows you to change different elements on your page based on the bit you selected. We looked at event handling, how we can have on-click, mouse over, mouse out, and add events to our pages. We looked at some jQuery effects. Remember fade, appear? Remember all those? And then last week, we looked at jQuery UI. And we looked at some advanced effects. We looked at some of the widgets we could use. And I showed you how you can integrate them into your page using a little bit of JavaScript. So hopefully, the scene is set for today's session. 3 topics for today. First one is how do we do field validation? In other words, you've seen if you click on a box and you click on another box and it's not quite right, how can you highlight there's a problem with that field? How can you alert someone to the fact they haven't completed it properly? That's the first thing we're going to look at. The second thing we're going to look at is if the form is not complete, we need to disable that submit button. So they can't submit the form if the data's wrong. Yeah, that's important. We need to be able to do that. And the third thing is there's a couple of widgets which are part of jQuery UI, which you could find rather useful when you start to build your forms. Okay? And that's just finishing things off. Important note for those doing assignment work, which is all of you, of course. There are built-in form validation libraries for jQuery. Do not use them. If you just do everything using built-in libraries, you will not learn JavaScript. And if you don't learn JavaScript, you won't be able to cope with next year, with 305, and you basically won't have any JavaScript skills. You'll just know how to copy and paste. I want you to build your form validation up yourself. Okay, step by step, go through the process. And as you go through the process, you will learn about the JavaScript language. Any existing code you use, you'll receive 0 marks for that. All right? That's really important. I'm going to make it very clear before we get started on this particular task. Now, what I've done is I've built a simple HTML form. Now, that's identical to the one I showed you in the second assignment, wasn't it? Remember? Was it the third one? Where we did, I think it was the third one, wasn't it? Where we built HTML forms. Really simple. A couple of text box, a password box. I've got a range input, which gives me a little slider, and I've also got a number input, to display numbers. So I've put a range of different form elements on here. I haven't put things like radio buttons and checkboxes on because I want you, for the higher grades, to do those yourself. Okay, I want you to learn and try and pick up some extra skills on this. And we're going to use this form as the basis for the tutorial, for the exercise I'm going to show you today. So you can see what it's based on. And as you can see, each of the inputs has a label. You see that, can't you? There's a label for each of the inputs. That becomes important because we're going to use the label to display the warning. We're going to change the colour of the label to tell the user there's a problem with the form element. So validating form fields. Okay, I'm going to take you through the process of creating the validation script. And this validation script, all it's going to do is going to validate to make sure the user's entered at least 5 characters in the box. Right, that's the purpose of my little validation script. You're going to have to apply what I've shown you and handle things like email fields, phone numbers, addresses, and numerical values. So I'm going to show you the process, and you can apply that process while you are building your form. Okay, now, why are we doing this? The important concept here is the user is going to be filling in these forms, okay, on your page. If they don't put the right data in there, you could let them hit submit, it sends the data to the server, there's a problem with the data, it then sends them back to the form. Problem with that, first of all, you've got to repopulate all the fields. Yeah, put the values they've already typed, otherwise you've got to start again, which is really annoying. Or, the other problem is, you've got to go back to the server each time, haven't you? You've got to go back to the server every time they try and submit the form. What we want to do is do all this work in the web browser without touching the server. So we're going to write some scripts which run in the browser, which check our form data before they even get a chance to submit. And that takes a load off your server. If you're dealing with thousands of users at the same time, and you can avoid having to submit these duff forms all the time, you're going to take a lot of pressure off the server and things will run faster. And because there's no round trip to the server, they get instant feedback. They haven't got to wait for the page to reload. It's instant. And we're going to use a couple of events. Form fields, we've talked about click, mouse over and mouse out. There's 2 more jQuery UI events we're going to respond to. The first one is focus. Focus is when the user selects the field, clicks inside the field, they get focus. And of course, the opposite of focus is blur. Therefore, when the field loses its focus and the user clicks somewhere else on the screen, a submit button or another field, it fires a blur event. So what we're going to do, we're going to specifically use that blur event. So every time they try and leave a field, we're going to check the values in that field and warn them if there's a problem. That's the key to what we're trying to do here. So here, we have a little example of how to use focus and blur. And you can see I've chained them together, haven't I? I've had them created one long bit of code. Now, remember that every input field has a name. Remember, that's the name that gets used in PHP when you submit the data. So we already know that every single input field has this unique name. Therefore, we can use that name as part of our jQuery selector. So input name equals UN is going to select that username text box. And we can guarantee that every single box has a unique name because that's how we built our form. If that wasn't true, the form wouldn't work. So now I'm saying, dot focus. And I've created a little function to handle when I select that box. And in this case, I'm just sending a message to the console, to the JavaScript console, like I showed you last week. Remember how you can send messages? And I've got another event, .blur here. And when I click somewhere else on my form, it will fire that event handler. And that will send another message. So it's always a good idea to put little messages in and just build it up step by step. And as you can see, I can test to make sure this works. I can refresh my page and I can try clicking in a box, clicking a different box and make sure that I get those messages. Because if that bit doesn't work, there's no point in carrying on. You've got to get it right. So let's have a look at the field value. So what we need to do is when we blur that field, we need to retrieve whatever they've typed into that box. Whatever that field contains, we need to retrieve it. And to do that, we have a special function called val. And if you call a val function on a form element, it gives you whatever the user's entered. If it's a radio button, each radio button has a value, it'll give you that value. So if you've got male, female as two values in a radio button, and they choose male and then choose something else, val will contain male. So you've got a very quick way of getting back what the user's typed in. So there we are, look. Now remember this from last week, week before? 2 weeks ago, wasn't it? We talked about this. Remember, this is whatever element has triggered that event. In this case, it's input name equals username. So I could just put input name equals username, but eventually I'm going to modify my script to handle all the text boxes on my form. So I want to make my script as generic as possible. So I've said here, console.log this.val, and that will print to the console, to the JavaScript console, whatever the user's typed into the box. Okay, so I'm one step closer, aren't I? I can see, I can retrieve I can respond to those events, I can retrieve a value, and I can display the value. So now we're going to do, next step, I want to count how many characters the user's typed in. Okay, that's my validation so far. If you're doing email validation, you might look for the position of the @ sign and make sure there's at least one dot somewhere and make sure the dot comes after the @ sign. So you'd look for locations of strings in strings. String pods would be the function you'd use for that one. But in our case, we're going to use a property called length. And length returns an integer value, which is how many characters are in that string. So there we are. So I've modified my script again. I've added a few more lines, step by step. First of all, I've pulled the string, the content, into a variable. Because I'm going to be using it several times, I want to store that value in a variable so it makes it easier to understand. So I log the variable, so I display the string in the JavaScript console, and I say if data.length is less than 5, display invalid data. If else, display valid data. So I'm not actually doing anything to the form itself, I'm simply logging this information and checking. I'm running some tests and just logging it to see what happens. So in theory, it should say username field left, it should display what the user's typed in, and then it should display valid data or invalid data in the JavaScript console. And that allows you to debug your code as you go along without having to mess with your form. Now, I think I mentioned this, the idea of using classes. I think I mentioned it several times. What I'm going to do is if the data is wrong, I want to put a border around my text box, a nice bright red border, and I want to make the label bright red as well. Okay? I could just add style to the elements, but that means I'm starting to embed style in my behaviors. What I'm going to do instead, I'm going to create two CSS selectors. I'm going to target a class called highlight text and a class called highlight border. I haven't said red border, I've said highlight border, which means if I want to change the highlight to green or to orange, I can simply go into my CSS file, change that line, and it will update every form on my page. But I've got this special class, I'm going to add and remove this class based on whether the data is valid. Okay, this is what I'm hoping to do. So look, so there's my if statement. Now look carefully at this. If it's invalid, this.add class, highlight border. Done. I'm adding that class to that input field. And if you were to open your DOM structure in your DOM browser, you would see that class would suddenly appear. So it would say input class equals highlight border. Okay, so I've magically added it using JavaScript on the fly. And as soon as it has that class attached to it, of course, it will apply that style and it will have a nice red border around the outside of it. And also, I want to change the label. Okay, this is tricky, isn't it? To change the label, I've got to go up, haven't I, to the next level up. Then I've got to go down to the label. So I've said this.parent .children label, so any child labels under the parent, add class, highlight text. So now it will add a new class to the label tag of that element saying highlight text. How I decide to highlight the text is entirely up to me. Highlight text could be making it red or orange or purple, but you can also in CSS add text to an element. So you could say, have a little bit of text at the end of the label saying minimum 5 characters in brackets, and then when it's correct, you remove that text. You see what I mean? Or you could have you could have a span in there, for instance, and add some text to the span, and have a nice custom error message that appears next to the label. So what happens now? That's the only style I've added. My style sheet is minimal. I've simply got it so if I click from the username to the password, and I haven't typed 5 characters in, I get a nice red border around it, and the label goes red. And I say, once you know how to do that, for the more advanced review, you could actually start to have spans inside your label and insert a custom message, custom.html inside that span, couldn't you? To say, must be 5 characters or something, or must be, red, or, must be an email address, or invalid email address, something like this. But fundamentally, what I've done is I've built a very simple validation script which will validate my text box. Trouble is, I'll do this first, right. Later on, when we do our form validation, we need to very quickly, at a glance, see which fields are validated. Okay, at a glance. So as soon as a field is validated, I want to add a flag to the field saying this field is okay. That makes sense? So as I leave the field, I want to check the data, put some error messages. If everything's cool, I want to stick a flag on that to say this contains valid data. And if they go back and change it and invalidate it, I want to take that flag away. Because then what we're going to do eventually is we're going to loop through all the fields to check them all, make sure everything's valid before we submit the form. So we've got to make sure that we have flags. And there we are. I've got another class which I've added. Nothing to do with style this time. This is purely a little flag. Okay? It's a Boolean flag. Can you see? If it's invalid data, I remove a class called valid. If the data is valid, I add a class called valid. And I can very quickly check that every form field has a valid class attached to it. Do you see why I'm doing that? It'll become clear a bit later on. But it means I can very quickly look at my DOM and any field that hasn't got that valid class on it isn't right. So I've got a very quick way of flagging up any issues on the form. Right, if you do it my way, you're going to have to write loads and loads and loads of JavaScript, because remember my selector was input name equals UN, wasn't it? I'd have to input name equals PW, input name equals name, input name equals address. I'd have to have loads and loads of different bits of JavaScript to handle every possible permutation for every possible field. The best thing to do is select based on class. So let's imagine you've got 5 fields that have to have a minimum of 5 characters. All you have to do is come up with a little name for that, like min length or something. And when you design your form, add a class min length to your field. And then we can attach this validation code to that class. So let's imagine you've got an email address field where you have to have, or password, you've got to have at least 12 characters, let's say. You've got to have at least 1 number. You've got to have at least 1 lowercase letter. Yeah, at least 1 uppercase letter. You could simply have a class equals length 12, uppercase, lowercase, number. And then you could actually write 1 bit of code to attach to each of those classes. And you can attach multiple validation to the same field. And if you had min length of 12, you could have min length class on lots of different form fields. You would then apply the same validation to lots of different fields. So the idea is you want to recycle your code. So look, that's how I've done mine. Because these are different types, type equals text tag equals password, I can't say type equals because they're different. So all I've done, I've put a little label on each of my form fields. Class equals text. And now, there's my selector. It's one little change, but that's made a huge difference. Because now it'll apply the same style validation, the same validation rules to both those text boxes. And all you've got to do is come up with a system to have different classes for different validations. Does that make sense? So you can come up with a nice modular system which allows you to validate any form. And all you then got to do, if you want to recycle that validation code, is simply save it in a JavaScript file and include it in your next project. And you've got a custom validation script which you can use over and over again. So I'm showing you the basis of what you can use for years. Once you've built this up and got it working, you can keep recycling the same validation code on every project. And that's what programming is all about recycling and reusing. Okay, we've done that one. Yep, class equals text, input text, and now, by doing those small changes, it's applying the same validation rules to both the username and the password fields. Okay, just with some minor changes. And you can do this so you can have a numerical test, can't you, to make sure the value is numerical and apply it to maybe the slider here, the house number here. Yeah, you can apply the numerical test to those two. And you combine it all into one nice JavaScript file, call it validation.javascript, and just keep using the same validation.javascript file in every project. So hopefully it should make life a bit easier for you. Okay, now, so far so good, but at the moment they could have invalid data and they can still hit the submit button. And if you hit that submit button, it will still submit the form data, even though there's red boxes everywhere. What we want to do is we want to stop the form from being submitted if the data is not valid. So in other words, if the data hasn't been corrected, they can click on that submit button from now to eternity and nothing will happen. Because you want to make sure that the data is correct. So this should give you a clue. There's another event handler which you need to use. And this event handler is submit. And you attach this to the form tag. Okay? And what this does, this event has to return true or false. And every time someone clicks on that submit button, it runs that event handler. If it returns false, the form doesn't get submitted, nothing happens. If it returns true, the form submission process takes place. So in this example, I put the alert saying the user submitted the form, so it'll pop up on the screen, but then no matter how many times I click that submit button, it will never ever submit the data because I've returned false. That's my starting point. My next job is to check the validation. So what we need to do, we need to cycle through every single field in our form, don't we? We need to start at the top of the form and check from top all the way through the bottom and look for any invalid fields. And we're going to use a flag. Remember the flag we created earlier? Remember the valid class we added? We're going to cycle through each of our form fields and see if it's got that valid class attached to it. And if they've all got the valid class attached to it, we return true. If even one of them is missing that valid class, we return false and the form doesn't get submitted. So, I've added a loop, a for each loop to this. And the way this works, I've said blah, 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 form input each. So I'm looking for any inputs inside the form tag. If I've got several forms on my page, I'd have to say form name equals whatever the form name is. Yeah? But I've only got one form, so this is going to select every single input in every single form on my screen, on my page. Remember I said that with a jQuery selector, if there's more than one match, it returns an array of results. It returns them all in this big array. Well, I'm going to use that feature. I'm going to cycle through each of those array indexes. So there's 4 on this form, aren't there? There's the username, password, there's the age and the house number. So it's going to do this 4 times because there's 4 inputs. And all I'm doing is I'm cycling through the inputs, I'm grabbing the contents of the inputs and I'm logging them. So I'm doing it step by step. In theory, this should print out every bit of data the user's entered in the form. If it doesn't, fix it before you carry on. Okay, so I'm checking that every form element is being returned. But I'm still returning false because I'm not ready to submit the form yet. I haven't done my tests. Now, as we look through the form, we've got to check each field to make sure it's valid, got valid data in. And remember, if it's got the class valid, it's good. If it's missing the class valid, it's bad. And what we're going to do, if any field is missing a class, we want to return false. We do not want to submit this form if there's bad data in it. Now, have you come across flag variables using booleans as a flag? Okay, 110 last year? No? Either that or you were asleep during the time when it was discussed. Okay, the idea of a flag is we could have this statement saying if, then else if, and go through each of our options, couldn't we? We've got a much easier way of doing it. What we do, before we go through our loop, we create a little variable, boolean, and set it to true. Okay, so think about this flag, the flag's up. Then we go through our loop. If we find the missing class, we lower the flag. So as soon as we find the missing class, we drop the flag down. At the end of the loop, if that flag is still up, what does it tell you? So we put the flag up, we loop through each of the form elements. If one of the form elements is invalid, we drop the flag. When we get to the end, that flag's either true or it's false, isn't it? If it's true, what does that mean?
The form will be submitted.
Yeah, everything's good, isn't it? The data is valid. Okay, so we're going to have this little flag, and if the flag is false when we get to the end, it means there's a problem with the form. So let's see this in action. Okay, there's 4 things you need to look for. First of all, can you see I've got a variable called valid? There's my flag, before the loop. I need to declare that before I start the loop. At the end of it, we'll see if it's true or false. We'll just display it on the screen for the time being. Here we have, look, if this has class valid, and look at this exclamation mark, what does that mean? It means not. So if it doesn't have the class valid, set the flag to false. Okay, does that make sense? So we check for the class valid, we invert the selection, so we look for the missing, the fact it's not there. If it's not there, we set valid to false. When we get to the end, if we log valid to the console, it'll either display true or false, won't it? Okay, so that's our little test to make sure everything's working before we start triggering the form. And of course, the final job to do is if the flag is still true, we return the form. If it's not true, we don't return we return false. So, if valid, return true. Yeah? So as soon as you hit the return stops the function, so it gets to there, stops and exits with true, so the form will get submitted. The next line, return false. Now this is a clever way of replacing an if-else statement with an if statement. You set the value to what you check the value, and if it's not true, you just do something else. Can anyone tell me how I could replace those 2 lines with 2 words? Knowing about Boolean logic. Think about it. Not return false, return valid. Remember, valid is true or false, isn't it? We want to return true or false from this function. So I could simply say, after the console log, return valid. So if valid is false, it returns false. If valid is true, it returns true, doesn't it? But I like this better because you can kind of see what's going on, can't you? It's clearer of what's taking place. But certainly if you don't want to do so much typing, there's a much easier way of handling the return value. We're declaring the Boolean variable, we need the Boolean return. We might as well use the same value. Right. Okay. Now, the problem is that my form will never ever submit. The form I just created, it won't work. Because I'm only testing the first two fields, aren't I? The last two, the numerical values, I'm not testing. If I'm never testing them, they're never going to get assigned a class of valid, are they? So you can spend hours trying to get this working, yeah, and it never works. You've got to make sure you apply validation to every field for this little system to work. If you miss one field out, it will never submit. So it forces you to apply validation to everything. The only way to round this would be to in your HTML, assign a class of valid in the HTML, wouldn't it? That would kind of circumvent the whole validation process on the field. But generally, you want to be checking every field, don't you? You want to make sure every single field has a valid value. So we've covered the key elements here. We've covered the idea of field-based validation, where you check each field as it's entered. We've covered the concept of form-based validation, where when you hit the submit button, you check everything to make sure everything's working. And I've shown you how you can create your own little JavaScript library using what I've taught you to pretty much validate anything. And once you've written your library, you can just keep recycling the library for every project you work on. It's a little library you can keep somewhere safe and reuse. The final thing I'm going to talk about there's a couple of widgets which in jQuery UI which you might find useful when you build your forms. I'm not going to go into detail on them. I'm going to show you exactly how they work because you know how to use jQuery widgets. Okay, the trick here is to make it so easy for the user to enter the right value. Validation almost becomes a technicality, becomes a formality at the end of it. And the first one is something called autocomplete. You can't, autocomplete basically, as someone types, it tries to complete for them, give them some options to choose from. You can't guarantee they won't just click in the box and type something different. But it's very useful if people tend to type the same thing in different ways. Okay, so let's talk about university. What year of your degree are you on? So some people would say year 3, some people would say stage 3, some people would say level 3. Yeah? If you're on second year, stage 2, level 2, year 2. If you want to just kind of tidy things up so everyone submits the same structure, if they start typing in year, or you can actually have an autocomplete that pops up and gives them the options. They can still override these and put their own thing in, but generally if someone's presented with a list of options, the temptation is always to go for one of those options. And you get more valid data being fed into your database. And next week? Yes, next week, I will show you how to build a simple autocomplete using data from an external source. Okay, so I'll show you how Ajax works. So for this one, if you use it now, you're going to have to code all the values into your JavaScript. Next week, I'll show you how you can use Ajax to dynamically pull data through as the user types with thousands of values. Another classic is date picker. Believe it or not, the date input type equals date doesn't actually give you a date field, a date picker. It's always better to add a proper date picker to your form, isn't it? Again, someone could just type something in there, but the temptation is always to use the date picker, isn't it, if it's there. So you've reduced 95% of errors just by having the date picker. A nice one is a tooltip. You could even put your validation rules in the tooltip, so when they hover over the box and click in it, you can pop up some helpful information for them. So you've got a nice sort of tooltip appears on the screen to help them fill the form in. Okay, so you can see how this is going to help. It won't remove any errors from your form, but it will reduce the number of errors you have to deal with. Spinner, numerical spinner, picking numbers. You know, number of copies on a printer, that sort of thing. Again, they can still type different things in, but when the user's presented psychologically, when the user's presented with controls, clickable controls on the screen, they tend to go with the clickable controls. You've still got to validate the value, but you've reduced the number of times you get errors. Okay, very short, doing quite well today. Just remind you about There's lots of online tutorials for jQuery and jQuery UI, loads of stuff online for this. They're the two books which I sort of recommend. Left one is the learning stuff, the right one is the help, how do I do this book, this one. So tentatively, once you get your head around jQuery UI, that tends to be the book you refer to. And that contains dozens and dozens of questions, recipes. How do I achieve this? How do I achieve that? And for the advanced jQuery user and jQuery UI user, that book on the right is brilliant. I've got it as an ebook, but I'm tempted to buy a paperback because it's sort of book you flick through, looking for solutions, looking for ideas. It's a reference book rather than a tutorial. So we've only got one session left on client-side scripting. One last session. And the last session is all about Ajax, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. We're going to be talking about how we update stuff on the page without having to go back to the server and refresh the whole page. So things like Google Docs, Facebook, they all use Ajax. You never refresh the whole page, do you? If you're in a chat room, you don't refresh the page, things just appear. And all that's happening is it's sending a request back to the server asynchronously to pull the data through and display it on the page. To understand this, you have to understand HTML, obviously, because you need to be able to structure it on the page. You need to be able to understand style sheets to be able to style it, but fundamentally, you need to understand JavaScript and jQuery. And that's why I'm leaving this topic to last, because it applies everything you've learned, jQuery, jQuery UI widgets, validation stuff, all in a new topic. And next year, you'll be doing a huge amount of Ajax work. Almost every single, in fact, everything is Ajax. There is no, for your website you build next year, there is no PHP in it at all. It's all Ajax calls to your API. So getting your head around Ajax calls is really, really important. Before we finish and get too excited, in 2 weeks' time, the assignment is due in. Okay, frightening. And then we start our final project. Remember I said it'd be a 20-week module, not 24 weeks, in terms of assessed work. The last 4 weeks of this term, I've got guest speakers in, I've got some workshops planned for you, and it's going to be formative assessment for the last bit we do. In other words, you'll have your grade after 20 weeks. The rest of it, you can enjoy yourself, you can learn some advanced skills, you can learn some useful stuff without this big thing hanging over you about how's it going to affect my grade. And we tend to find that works much better when we cover the more advanced topics. So just enjoy it, see what you can achieve, see how you get on with it. We'll give you formative feedback on that last piece of work, but there's no summative assessment. There's no grade on your grade book for this. The final topic is we're going to be building web servers. The 4 topics are we're going to be building Linux servers. We're going to be working with MySQL. We're going to be building, configuring, testing, porting your creative database across to it, to your new server. We're going to be covering Apache and web servers, building, configuring, installing modules, securing, understanding fundamentally. And the final topic is we're going to be looking at how we transfer files, FTP, SFTP, how we use CyberDuck and FileZilla. And they're also going to be covering something called SMB, which is, how you have your network drives? You can put stuff on network drives. I'll show you how you can turn your server into a network drive for your computer. So you can have a network disk mounted and drag files to and from it on your computer. To do this, we're going to be using Raspberry Pis. They're those little cheap computers. Okay. In the labs, we've got Raspberry Pis to share out amongst us. If you want to work outside lab, you've got 2 options. You can either go and buy one, okay, and that's why I'm telling you now, because if you're going to buy one, you need a week or 2 to get it. Or I'm going to show you how to use something called VirtualBox, which allows you to create virtualized servers on your home computer. If you do, whatever you do, in the lab sessions, I want you to work with the Raspberry Pis. I want you to work with the hardware. And the Raspberry Pis use an SD card for storage. So if you work with the Raspberry Pi, you bring an SD card, you plug it in, you do your work. At the end of the lab, you pull the SD card out with all your operating system on and software. Take it home, use it on your Raspberry Pi at home. That's how I want to work. If you're doing VirtualBox, it's not quite as exciting, but you can still get all the tasks done. But VirtualBox is free. So have a think over the next week or two whether you want to go down the Raspberry Pi route at home or whether you want to do the Raspberry Pi in labs and do VirtualBox for your homework, okay? And we start that in 2 weeks' time, okay? So that's it. Thank you very much.